giving you time to get some lunch in, and I wasn't sure if there were other people coming. Lisa, how do I do this for the sound? Hello, people in McGee. How are you doing? You are McGee, aren't you? Yeah. Okay. Look, apologies. I've got a PowerPoint presentation here. I have no way of figuring out any technological way of getting you to see that as well. So I apologise in advance. Hi, Bill Rolston, but I know most of you know me. So anyway, what I'm going to do here, some of you were probably at Johnny Byrne's seminar last month, where which was I think the first of these IPAC seminars. IPAC being a sort of an umbrella for INCORE, TJI, and various people in sports studies, arts and humanities, whatever, are doing stuff that may be considered related to conflict in the north. And Johnny Byrne did a talk based on his postgraduate research on interface areas, which was really interesting. Mine is very different here, in that I am for the most part not reporting on research that I've done. I'm reporting on an elongated, massive, mind-boggling literature review that I did, where I signed a contract with OFMDFM to try to produce a report, and I'll tell you the details of the brief in a minute, which tries to tell us what do we know about the position of politically motivated ex-prisoners in the north. In the end, I located more than 200, well, about 200 pieces, and I'll talk about them, or what sort of pieces they were, in a minute or two. So I'm not reporting on my research. 3 of the pieces were mine. So that's as much as I can say in terms of individual research. However, it's not just a sort of, I read 3 newspaper articles and I'm going to tell you about them. It's something more substantial than this. Nobody has sort of done this, pulled all this information together. And it astounded me at a number of levels, not least in the amount of stuff that there was. And also, I should say, it sort of, astounded is maybe not the right word, it confirmed what was the common wisdom among the ex-prisoner constituency as to what these issues are. The research just confirmed it over and over and over again. So without further ado, that's the topic, politically motivated ex-prisoners in Northern Ireland. As I say, it was a major literature review conducted for OFMDFM, and they gave me a brief which was, here are the objectives of the research. I had to identify the available research and information that we had in relation to that issue. I must say that I took that word information with a pinch of salt, because if I'd started looking at newspaper articles, etc., I might still be at it a year later. So I stuck to research. I'll tell you in a minute how I defined that. They asked me to determine demographic and socioeconomic information that was available on ex-prisoners, ex-combatants and their families. And they asked me to review specifically what information there was in the literature about, under a number of headings: employment, social inclusion, health inequalities, barriers to services, that's both private and public services. For example, an example of private might be insurance, and I'll go back to that. And last but not least, what was the contribution of the ex-prisoner constituency to conflict transformation? And last but not least, they asked me to identify gaps in knowledge. This is as close as the research may have come to making any recommendations. Just identifying, at the risk of beginning to sound a bit like Donald Rumsfeld, what unknown knowns there were out there. So, as I said there at the start, there was more than you might think. There was certainly more than I thought there would be in terms of research. In fact, originally I started off really like a sort of a bee in clover, and I just started collecting everything about the situation as regards imprisonment over the conflict. And basically OFMDFM wrapped me in the knuckles and said, no, you're going too far. Thankfully they did, because that would have been another 200 or 300 pieces. I found about 200 pieces, and I just want to say that it's not all research in that formal sense of the word, or that sort of word that we might use when we're trying to be real proper academics. What I mean by that is that there was a lot of information, especially while the conflict was raging, that was not research in that strict academic sense of the word. It was often in pamphlet form, it was often polemical, it was often politically motivated, and I suppose if I wanted to be a real sort of die-hard intellectual academic, I would have said, well look, you know, I would have ignored that altogether, or at very least put it into some sort of second division as regards information. I did neither of those, because it was very important in two senses. All this pamphlet information, etc., was very important in two senses. Firstly, in the absence of formal academic research through most of the conflict on this issue, that was the only information that was available, so it would have been stupid to reject it. And secondly, in point of fact, in the middle of the polemics, in the middle of the political posturing that frequently existed in many of these pamphlets, there was lots of really important information, and to repeat, information was not available elsewhere. So I included everything from academic research to political pamphlets. So let's start with the first question. What are we talking about here? How many politically motivated prisoners were there? Well, there are some things we can say for certain, but actually overall, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. Let me start with the certain. There were 350 men arrested, I think it was actually 349, arrested and interned initially in 1971. When internment finally came to a close, 4 years or so later, overall 1,981 people, mostly men, had been interned. 1,874 of those were nationalists and 107 loyalists. Now that's the sort of precision that academics love when they're writing pieces. But it starts to go downhill from here on. If you ask how many people went through prison, there is no answer. Sherlock and McAvoy in one of the pieces listed estimate that there were 15,000 Republicans and between 5,000 and 10,000 loyalists in prison. Now that between 5,000 and 10,000 is a terribly imprecise figure. And even then, it's not agreed on. For example, loyalists themselves, loyalist ex-prisoners organisations in particular, frequently put that figure higher. Tom Roberts, for example, of EPIC, states that he reckons there were upwards of 12,000 loyalist prisoners. So we're in a sort of strange territory here where we don't know how many there were. In fact, what's very interesting is OFMDFM had asked to do this research through this committee that they had under Bruce Robinson, the head of the civil service, where civil servants and others, including from the Equality Commission and ex-prisoners representatives, meet regularly and talk about these things. And as a result of what everybody was saying and what my research, my literature review confirmed, one of the last acts Bruce Robinson did as head of the civil service was to formally write to the Justice Minister David Ford saying, could you please tell us how many politically motivated ex-prisoners went through the system, to which David Ford has already replied saying, we don't know. Jameson, Sherlock and Grounds reckon that politically motivated former prisoners make up between 14 and 31% of the population of Northern Ireland males between 50 and 59, and between 4 and 12% of those between 60 and 64. Again, not very precise. 4 to 12% is not, you know, if it was a smart bomb, it wouldn't be hitting its target, let's put it that way. Some area studies, some local studies that have been done have allowed for a little bit more precision. There are a number that can be pointed out, like one that was done on the New Lodge Road by Paul O'Neill, and the other by Mike Ritchie in the Upper Springfield. In the Upper Springfield area, for example, he reckoned that 5.6% of the population of that area were ex-prisoners, and an estimated 11% of the population, 25% or over. Could that be replicated across all other areas like Upper Springfield? It's just impossible to know. Certainly, the New Lodge research was in no sense more precise. They located every ex-prisoner in the New Lodge area, and so they could give numbers, but they don't give percentages in the same way that Mike Ritchie does. Finally, and I keep meaning to write to Mary Corcoran to ask her where she came up with this. In her book on women's experience of imprisonment here, she said that there were 1,018 women served time as politically motivated prisoners, the vast bulk of whom were Republicans. I don't know where she got such an exact figure, and as I said, I keep meaning to write to her and ask her, and I must get round to it. But it would be great to have such a figure in relation to men, but it doesn't exist. So, this is my point, I'm just summing it up here. A remarkable lack of precision, especially in relation to men. And one last point to make about the issue of figures. These figures, imprecise as they are, relate only to those who've served time in prison. There is a whole other area of ex-combatants who were never processed through the prison system, which we know nothing about and will never know anything about. That, I know in relation to some of the comparative work that I've done, that's the difference between this society and some others. For example, in South Africa, it might not be the first thing that people say to you, but when you engage them in conversation, very often they say to you, oh yes, I'm an ex-combatant, and they may not have done time. But that's something that doesn't happen, to my knowledge, to the same extent here. So that's another huge unknown figure to be added in there. Okay, let's go through the findings in some sort of schematic order. First point is that during the conflict, there were very few questions asked about the negative effects of imprisonment. Why was that? Well, it's sort of self-evident, but I'll just spell it out anyway. My feeling is that the collective identity trumped private problems, private emotions. There was a feeling sometimes among the organisations that the ex-prisoners came from and the prisoners themselves that showing emotion or distress was a sign of weakness, that it went against some sort of macho self-image, and more to the point, might actually be handing something to the prison authorities that they could use that weakness against you in some way if you said that you were cracking up under the strain of imprisonment or whatever. There were no loud demands from prisoners while the conflict was raging for emotional support or for counselling, and indeed, either during imprisonment or indeed after they were released, when often a lot of ex-prisoners report that that's when the negative issues became much more apparent to them, much more in the front of their consciousness. So, not much going on while the conflict raged. While the conflict raged, there was also not much in terms of reliable research coming from outside the prison system, from academics or others, about the negative effects of imprisonment among politically motivated prisoners and, interestingly, importantly, their families. Almost no one asked prisoners, ex-prisoners, partners, or children what that experience of imprisonment was doing, had done to them. It was only as the conflict began to transform itself into the peace process that such questions began to be asked. And increasingly so, they were asked not least by prisoners and ex-prisoners themselves, and indeed the researchers began to ask the questions to the outside researchers. What I'm saying is that the peace process created the space that for questions that couldn't have easily been asked during the conflict, or asked easily, to now be put on the agenda. Oh, sorry. The most notable finding, I think, that comes out of these almost 200 pieces of writing is this: that imprisonment has mental health consequences for prisoners and their families, even in a situation such as there existed here of strong solidarity and a strong sense of resistance. I've argued in other things that I've written that this solidarity, and in fact the notion of resistance and communities of resistance, means that sometimes communities and individuals can be remarkably resilient when you expect them to be lying on heaps in the corner. They are managing to handle incredibly traumatic experiences. I think that's true, it's provable, but at the same time, this other point began to emerge. There were mental health consequences. And for this reasoning, ex-prisoners and their organisations began to acknowledge that such things as counselling services were needed. And it was no longer a taboo issue to discuss this, or no longer a taboo thing to go and seek support. In fact, in some of the organisations such as Kirsten and the Nehimi, they have trained counsellors who are themselves former prisoners. Another controversial finding that came out of the research was that relationships with partners and children suffered during imprisonment. For example, I did a piece of research with a colleague at Queen's, Mike Tomlinson, back in the late 1980s, where we interviewed life sentence prisoners and their families, and we found that, for example, we found a much better record of relationships being maintained despite long terms of imprisonment than you would expect, for example, if you'd gone and looked at an ordinary prison population in the United States or Britain. So that sort of resistance notion, that resilience notion came through. People were managing to survive in their relationships. In fact, maintaining good, in some cases, relationships with kids who'd never actually known them outside of a prison wall. So there was that evidence, but at the same time there's also a lot of evidence coming out of the literature that relationships suffered. Whether that was in terms of divorces, breakdowns, tension, financial difficulties, emotional difficulties, and children in particular form a huge part of that question of difficulty. In addition, renewing relationships upon release wasn't a straightforward task, as I'm told many prisoners, when they were still in, thought it might be. Because they weren't walking back into the stream that they'd left, they were walking back into a stream that had moved a long way along since. Kids had grown up, kids who were now teenagers were telling parents to F off. You know, you didn't get to tell me anything when I was growing up, so you don't get to tell me anything now just because you're back in the house. As one person I interviewed for another purpose, one son of a prisoner said to me, he was a young teenager when his dad came back, and he said one morning he woke up and said to himself, "Who's that man sleeping in my dad? Who's that man sleeping in my ma's bed?" And you know, this notion that somehow life is never going to be the same again. And one way in which it was not the same again, which has been well documented in some research, is that women who may have been subordinate in the original relationship were now no longer subordinate. They had managed to be leaders of the household, they had managed to handle the finances, everything that was involved in running a household, and there was no way himself was coming back in again to be the paterfamilias. And so there were relationship issues to be worked out then. Keeping going with the findings, as I've just hinted there, release from prison raised a whole raft of issues around some practical matters. The ones most often mentioned in the research are practical matters such as financial survival, finding a job, and frequently the issue of accommodation, especially if you come out as a single ex-prisoner, an ex-prisoner with no relationship, either because you didn't have one before you went in or it broke up while you were in. There are other questions that come out too from the research quite clearly, other issues. And perhaps the biggest one that's been well charted by people at Queen's, including what's her name gone for me? Ruth Jameson. The question of ageing. That, you know, we're a long way into the peace process now. 1994 ceasefires, 1998 Good Friday Agreement, 2000 all the politically motivated prisoners were out. They're getting no younger, and there are issues there about mental health, about financial difficulties, about some people having physical injuries, the results of which are only coming to the fore now. So they're coming out into a society where they are bereft of skills or bereft of current skills. They have no pensions, they have no savings, and there are all sorts of those issues become clear through the literature. Of the post-prison difficulties, the one that comes out most strongly in the literature is the question of employment. Ex-prisoners found their path to employment blocked not only by their lack of skills, and not only about issues of security, but also by the prejudices of others, including potential employers. Also, they found themselves blocked by legislation and policy, which meant that discrimination against ex-prisoners is not illegal. It is possible to discriminate against a prisoner on the basis of them having a record, and in many cases this is not illegal. For example, ex-prisoners report difficulties in dealing with service providers in both the private and the public sphere. For example, there can be difficulties obtaining insurance, certainly difficulties in obtaining start-up capital for business purposes. Barriers can exist in terms of compensation for injury, and in fact, I think, yes, I'm going to list them here in a minute. This has been referred to by Pete Sherlow and others as residual criminalisation. It's almost like a double jeopardy thing. You've done your time, you're out, but yet the fact that you have been in prison is still coming up, held against you in many ways. For example, ex-prisoners are barred from many areas of employment, such as the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service. There are explicit legal blocks, such as the Fair Employment and Treatment Northern Ireland Order, which bars them from employment as police officers. For a long while, acquiring a licence for driving a taxi was not an option for ex-prisoners, but that no longer applies. That's been changed. There's the whole question of disclosure of criminal records. Many ex-prisoners, and it's reported in the literature, argue that the dilemma is that do you report the criminal conviction, quote unquote, and thereby lose the chance maybe of competing for the job, or do you not report it, and then if it's found out later you get sacked for not reporting it. Republicans in particular are quite happy to not report it on the grounds that they were criminals and that this wasn't a criminal conviction, but that doesn't necessarily paddle your canoe if the boss says to you, by the way, I've just discovered you were in prison for 15 years, why didn't you tell me? There's the issue of compensation for injuries under criminal injuries legislation, which means that I can get beaten up outside a pub and claim injury, but some people in this room can get beaten up outside a pub and not claim injury, criminal injury. I have no idea why that exists. Loans for small business setup, mortgages are frequently refused. Insurance is a big issue, I haven't put that one in there. And then there's two other things that come up. One is that it can be difficult, if not impossible, to get a visa to visit countries such as the United States or Australia, unless you're some prominent ex-prisoner. And there's an issue about being unable to adopt or foster children, which may sound like, bottom of the list, they're not really important, but you think about it. If you've not had a relationship, or if your relationship broke up, if you are now a prisoner, or an ex-prisoner, male or female, in middle or late middle age, and saying, God, I missed the opportunity of having kids, I wonder, can we adopt some kids? That is an option that's not open to you. Continuing and coming near the end of what the findings brought out, release brought not just difficulties, but it also brought new challenges and opportunities. And perhaps the most obvious thing there is the whole issue of conflict transformation. It is clear as a bell, that ex-prisoners have done remarkable work in terms of conflict transformation, especially at the area of the local communities in which they live. They've developed their own organisations, they've contributed to community development in their own communities, they've made contacts across what might have been first thought unimaginable divides. Joint activities between ex-prisoner groups are common, and this is not a new research, but it's my own assessment that many of these go on below the radar, and this is where they belong, actually, as far as I'm concerned, because sometimes the media has its own agenda, and if they start turning the spotlight too much on these cross-community activities, they can endanger the chances of the things being effective. Now, what about gaps in knowledge? There are quite a few of those, and I'll just list them this way. Firstly, we know more about the prison experience of Republicans than about Loyalists, out of these almost 200 pieces. On the Republican side, we know much more about the prison and post-prison experience of prisoners and ex-prisoners from the IRA than those from other Republican groups such as the INLA and the official IRA. We know almost nothing about the situation of current dissident prisoners. We know more about the experience of male prisoners and ex-prisoners than about females. And given the paucity of female prisoners on the Loyalist side, this issue relates mainly to Republicans, although, in a funny sort of way, the much more interesting question is, how have the few Loyalist female ex-prisoners managed to re-immerse themselves in the communities from which they were taken on imprisonment? There's no direct research available on ex-combatants who have not been imprisoned, and given some of the things I said earlier, it's difficult, well, it's impossible to see how that gap might ever properly be filled, especially in the light of the Boston College debacle. There's a body of knowledge about the effects of imprisonment both during and afterwards on prisoners' families, but arguably there is room for more research in this regard. I'm specifically saying that I think there's a lot more room for looking at the experiences of wives and partners of ex-prisoners, of former prisoners, both during the prison experience and indeed during the re-entry process when they came back into the family from which they'd been removed for a long time. And in the same vein, Right? In the same vein, we know precious little about the effects of imprisonment on prisoners' children, both during imprisonment and after release. And even then, we know more in that regard than we do about the effects of imprisonment on the wider family of prisoners. There's only a few mentions in any of the literature, and I think 3 or 4 at most, and they're in literature about Republicans, that give any idea of what parents went through seeing sons and daughters in prison. And not only in terms of things like, for example, the emotional aftermath of that experience, but also the issue about, for example, an issue that wives and partners had too, of supporting the prisoner when they were inside, not just emotionally, not just politically, but also financially. You know, when somebody writes out and says, I want another pair of trainers because I'm running around the track 5 miles a day, or running around the prison yard 5 miles a day, where do you get the money? Who pays for those trainers to be sent up? Those sorts of issues in relation to parents have hardly been explored at all. There's little research on the relationship difficulties of prisoners and of ex-prisoners and their partners. There's only 2 pieces that I came across that specifically questioned prisoners and their partners about this, and both of them hinted, just a very, very tiny hint, that all was not rosy in the garden. I think that people were being very protective of the information in relation to that, and that may well still be the case. I'm not urging that we should all go out and identify a whole pile of ex-prisoners and partners to say, well, how's your love life been since you get out? But I am just saying that that is something that we know precious little about. There's been only one study, the study by Ruth Jameson, done on the effects of the ageing process of ex-prisoners, but indeed that is a huge issue, as I hinted earlier, which can only increase in importance as time goes on. And very little research is focused specifically on the experience of prisoners' wives, whether their partners have been in prison. In fact, one of the most interesting pieces, I did mention it in the research, although it didn't really cover it, and OFMDFM let me away with it. There's one novel by a journalist who's dead now, Jack Holland, called The Prisoner's Wife, which has its moments of getting close to what that experience must have been like, written from the point of view of the prisoner's wife and the difficulties she faced. The issue of residual criminalisation has been well rehearsed, especially in meetings and seminars and conferences and focus groups of former prisoners. But I think there's room for further research here. In particular, more case studies could be gathered on the experience and effects of residual criminalisation. What I mean by that is that the general picture is known, but the details of, you know, when you went for home insurance, for house insurance, what did they say to you? Did they refuse you? How did they refuse you? What reason did they give you for refusing you? Did they specifically say it was because you were an ex-prisoner, or did they find some other reason for refusing you? If you went for business startup money and whatever, Invest NI, whatever, said no thanks, what was their reasoning? What was the process that happened there? I think that not enough of that is known, of the actual nuts and bolts of how this residual criminalisation works. Indeed, what's very interesting to me is that I only had that little bit of a dealing with this group at Stormont under Bruce Robinson, but it seems to me that some of the civil servants attached to that group have been working very hard in relation to this issue of residual criminalisation, meeting with employers, meeting with insurance companies, meeting with mortgage providers to raise this issue with them. Of course, one of the most obvious paradoxes is that they are civil servants of a government which is itself discriminating against ex-prisoners in relation to such issues as criminal injuries, compensation and adoption. And so perhaps the spotlight doesn't need to just be pointed out towards the private sector, but ought to be turned back towards
also government service, of course.
And towards the civil service, towards all of that.
You can't be a civil servant.
You can't be a civil servant?
If you're an ex-prisoner.
Excuse me, didn't know that, Sheila. I'm nearly finished, and then please raise this and anything else. For example, there's some of the points. How widespread is the practice of employers failing? Sorry, there's a voluntary code for employers that has been drawn up from Stormont, and employers, especially big employers, know about this. And it's the point about saying that, you know, that there was a political situation here, there was a conflict situation that people got caught up in, and that should all be taken into consideration. There is lots of evidence that employers don't follow this voluntary code. how do they go about that? Is there a difference between employers in the private sector and those in the public sector? How systematic is the refusal of service providers to meet the needs of ex-prisoners? For example, banks lending or not lending to ex-prisoners, insurers not insuring ex-prisoners. All these questions provide scope, I'm saying, for lots of further investigation. Finally, and I just need to add this, although it was not directly the focus of this literature review, we know very, very little about the connected issue of the experience of prison officers and what that did to them. Okay, that's me, folks. Questions, comments?
No, I just wanted to ask a question, Michelle. What actually did civil servant? You know, really working in the post office or?
No. People working for local government and the Storm government. And what do they call it? They used to call it the Imperial Civil Service, if it's like customs and excise or whatever. Are all of those stuff out of bounds?
I was get the actual, you know, this, and this, but as far as we're concerned, it's just civil servants or ex-prisoners are rewarded in civil service.
Well, I have to say, unless I've been dumb, I didn't notice that in reading these hundreds of pages. So maybe that's another gap in the knowledge. So, like the situation, for example,
Well, that's why I asked the question, what is civil service? I mean, you talk about the other one. Remember, I actually went to Sinn RDS in 1972, and it was this kind of rule that nobody could join the British civil service, and the Southern civil service. But then, as you know, the post-war nationalisation, people who worked in coal mines, bus drivers, train drivers, banks, were all civil servants. Do you understand what I mean?
I do.
And we actually expelled that particular point because the person who actually got up was actually graduating to be a teacher, says, come to sit down or I have to leave the party because I can't help it, I have to give an overweight in the teacher.
You see,
so I mean, that's what I'm saying.
It's never been like the German situation where if you're employed as a teacher or a train driver or whatever, you're a public servant, you're a civil servant, and they had this whole thing about Berufsverbot where if you joined the Communist Party or whatever, that you were thrown out of the job or you couldn't get the job if you were known to be a communist. That was a big thing in Germany, but the definition of civil servant is much narrower here. But it's interesting then, you know, the whole ruffle at that time over Miriam Cardle. She was actually employed in Stormont as an advisor to the minister, but was she a civil servant? No. No? What category is she? She's not employed. Is she employed by the party?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Well, I wanted to ask, you know, about the working gaps that you're talking about, and something about what you attribute all that to, and how much has the kind of lack of acknowledgement of the conflict as a conflict or a war, do you know, how much is that anything to do with it, or what else would you attribute this, you know, very serious gaps in the kind of, and inconsistencies as well that you talk about?
Maybe three levels of an ask, three things.
Okay.
Number one, it's a gap that came for such a long time from the prisoners and their organisations themselves. That, you know, the whole point was winning the war, and the prison was part of winning the war, and that all these other issues were just, you know, you did your whack, you just, you know, gritted your teeth and went through with it. So, you know, they were late starting down that road. For academics, there was a whole other sort of steel curtain drawn around that issue in terms of that, you know, if you did want promotion, if you did want acceptability in your organisation, such as the one that we're sitting in at the moment, it was probably better to do something that wasn't that close to the knuckle. I mean, you could, for example, do really good stuff on ex-prisoners in Palestine or something, but maybe doing it in Belfast or Derry might have been more of a problem in career terms. And then the third thing, I think, just is that if you put it in context, there's an awful lot more we don't know. I mean, I think, for example, we know remarkably little in the end about victims either, despite what's been done. I've said that, for example, prison officers, apart from a few sort of heroic pamphlets that they've done about how brilliant they were or whatever, there's nothing about what it's been like for them in terms of drink problems, of PTSD, of relationship problems. You know, I think actually our ignorance, I think our ignorance in this area is par for the course.
Just a couple of quick comments you know already. That I'm slightly worried about the focus on ex-conflict prisoners being completely different from ordinary ex-prisoners. I would say about 70 or 80% of what you said in relation to the problems of ex-prisoners apply across the board.
And more.
I would like to see if you're focusing on the conflict prisoners, a much clearer focus on what is special about the ex-conflict prisoners, because so much of what you've said applies across the board to ex-prisoners. And then just a source of information. I'm involved in homeless hostel in Portadown, where we get a lot of people from probation, and there's a huge amount of information from those sources of people, particularly for people who haven't got anywhere to go. I'm not sure whether you get access to it. In the Edward Street Hostel, we have lots of ex-prisoners. All of these problems. I'm not sure how many of them are ex-conflict, how many of them are not. Some of them try out the guns every now and again.
Maybe not.
There's a huge amount of probation-based information which I think we need to tap, and they might be able to assist in distinguishing between the conflict, the post-conflict, which you're particularly interested in, and the general population.
Could I answer that at first, assuming a flippant answer? That's not what I was asked to do. That's not what OFMDFM asked me to do, so I didn't do it. And that's not as flippant as it seems, but that was the brief. Secondly, if I had been doing it, I could report, I reckon my own suspicion is I could report very quickly on what we know about non-political prisoners and ex-prisoners, i.e. almost nothing. Right? There's been very little research done in this society on that. And then another level of explaining that to me is, which I find, you know, as an outsider looking in, is the sense in which many of the ex-prisoners, and don't jump at me here guys, but many of the ex-prisoners organisations themselves don't want to touch that issue. They see themselves as so different from ordinary decent criminals, if you want to call it that, that is not part of their brief to take up the issue of anybody other than politically motivated ex-prisoners. And I think this is really interesting. A colleague at Queen's, Phil Scraton, constantly points out that we are the only region of these islands that does not have an ex-prisoner support group involving ordinary decent criminals, as it were.
Well,
Sorry, Shana jumped in first. And Sean Cobb. Why am I sharing this at work?
the first thing that I would like to say is that I thought it was fairly good and fairly extensive, and it's raised as many questions as it has actually answered. But having said that, one of the things about political ex-prisoners is while you're in jail, you see, you know, your imprisonment is the problem. But the only problem that you have while you're in jail is the fact that you are in jail.
Mm-hmm.
All the other problems that everybody else is having about the fact that you're in jail, and generally they tend to go over your head. And it wasn't until probably Tarn Hall, 93 or in around then, that Republicans actually allowed themselves to start thinking in terms of, look, there's guys getting out of jail here after 10, 15 years and longer. We're going to have to do something more than want to do in the PD club and give them a couple £100 and get them a job on a black taxi or whatever it is. We're going to have to take this whole problem a lot more seriously than what we have up to now. But like I say, during the course of the conflict, we didn't allow ourselves to really consider any of that. And for ourselves in jail, it was simply, you know, I don't have any problems. My problem is that I'm in prison. Once I'm no longer in prison, I leave my problems behind. And it was like, you know, the idea of once you come out of prison, you take that overcoat off and you leave it behind you and you move into your wonderful new life. You're not up against the brick wall.
No, I remember that period you're talking about because I remember being at something that Taranal organised way early on, must have been 93 or 94, where Lawrence McCune said, basically, that we have to start worrying about the problems that a lot of Republican ex-prisoners have. We've been avoiding this issue, and I remember being struck by that that was something I'd never heard before, a lot of years before, and coming from him was particularly emphatic.
Yeah.
Sure.
Bill, can you say a bit more about why you were commissioned? What's the aims and objectives of the project? Just to kind of give us a sense of, okay, so this is really fantastic research, and I'm stealing on you for the thing. But what impact is this going to have? Because the problems that you've highlighted are just going to continue, and unless we get a handle on how we address these issues, then, as I just said to Robert earlier on, it's not so much the prisoners now, it's their children and grandchildren that we'll be dealing with as a society. So how can this research impact on service delivery and policy development beyond criminal justice issues?
This was not my research. That's where I started, and I'm not disowning anything. It's not research. It's a huge literature review that I did. So that was a very specific, very narrow brief. What was in the heads of Bruce Robinson and this committee for commissioning the research? I'm not quite sure. I suspect that what it was to literally pull all the stuff together so that whenever they were making approaches to whether it was the Department of Justice or Health and Social Services about provision, about adoption or whatever, or insurance company, that they had the evidence at their fingertips. They could point out and say, go on our website, it's all there, all the information is there. I suspect also that for the ex-prisoners who were involved in that committee, that they saw it from the same point of view, to say, look, you know, this wasn't just sort of wee mice running around our head, all the information is there. Does this affect anything? I honestly don't know. I have no idea. I was with them for a short while. I'm not involved with that group anymore. I have a feeling that there's a couple of civil servants. I don't know many civil servants. I've led a sheltered life, but I met a couple of the younger civil servants who are involved with that group, who I was very impressed by. Very impressed by their commitment to try to sort of keep picking away at this edifice of residual criminalisation. And as far as it arms them to continue that, I think it might be useful in the long term. Colin?
Yeah, I must say I found Lou's what you had to say fascinating, but for me the most interesting bit, the most original for me, was around the ageing issue and just the question of time and longitudinal dimension of this. And as you were speaking, I was thinking firstly in historical comparative terms, and then in general comparative terms. And of course, in historical terms, you don't have these issues in Ireland, in political violence in Ireland, because campaigns generally last 3 to 5 years, and then there's some sort of amnesty at the end of it. And that was kind of the position all the way up to the 1960s, at the end of the border campaign. So then I thought internationally, and think about rebellions in the 19th century, the Jamaica rebellion, the Fenians and so on. They last a brief period of time, typically a year, 3 years, and then they're finished. And often there's an amnesty a few years after that. Fenians are a bit different because some Fenians did spend a long time in jail, but there weren't all that many. So the more I thought about it, it seemed to me that it's actually quite an important phenomenon here, that there's, if you think internationally, as I said, historically, rebellions in the 19th century were over pretty quickly. If you think in Asian terms, you get the Vietnam conflict going on for 30 years or so, but that's after the Second World War. If we think of rebellions in Asia, anti-colonial rebellions in Asia, and I think the Boxer Road, like I think they're over quite quickly. So then in Africa as well, they're over quite quickly. But it's only, I think, after the Second World War that this phenomenon of the long war emerges, which can go on for decades. And I think there's partly an ideological thing, as the collapse of colonialism, but it's also a technological thing that portable high-power weapons, I think, are part of the thing, because the insurgents, the US can't be wiped out. They will always have the capacity to fight back, and it's very difficult for even a powerful state to wipe them out, as we saw in Vietnam. So what I suspect is that there's a really big issue here, which is around the relationship between the aging of political prisoners, while serving political prisoners as part of the process, and the strain that puts on relationships and family groups and kinship and friendship groups and so on and so forth, and the emergence of a kind of a long war strategy by insurgent groups after the Second World War. And I haven't teased it out in here, but I think it's, if you take some of Tom's points, take this point, just think there's a very interesting issue here. But there's some relationship, I feel, between this kind of long war strategy and issues around the specificity of this experience, the fact that it's so long. Because in Ireland, previous generations of these political prisoners very rarely spend such long periods in jail.
I'm doing a wee bit of comparative research at the moment between here and South Africa, and I think that actually the parallels with South Africa in the last 30 years are closer than the parallels with, for example, Ireland 100 years ago. I agree completely with you. The experience of former ANC and other operatives is like what ex-prisoners here talk about, not like what O'Donovan Ross talked about or anything else.
Yeah, and the MK people actually went and studied, or the ANC people went and studied, they went to Vietnam, they studied the long war strategy, and they actually reported back to South Africa. And again, if you look at in Latin American terms, the 19th century rebellions against Spanish generally in the last few years, they were generally successful, apart from one of them that had to be forced to be liberated, which was Paraguay, was it? This phenomenon whereby FARC can fight on for 30 years, that's a new phenomenon that didn't appear in the 19th century. The Tamil Tiger issue, again, of course they're wiped out now, they fought for 20 years. It's quite unique in Asian terms.
Robert, did I cut you off at one point?
No, it was just earlier what Tom said about getting an input from people who would deal with ODCs, ordinary cases of criminals. They actually are in the ACT were on this working group, so there is actually an input from.
Can I put you on the spot, Tim, and ask about the probation thing, about whether that rang, what Tom was saying, rang any bells for you?
Yeah, I mean, you quite rightly highlight the gaps in our knowledge around politically motivated prisoners, but the gaps are far greater on the ordinary prisoners, particularly in the Northern Irish context. There's very little work that I'm aware of in this area. And I would agree with what Tom said, that a lot of what you're not there would have been familiar, 60–70% of it, if you crossed out political prisoners and just put prisoners, relationship difficulties, employment, accommodation, those are the sort of bread and butter of the probation service, and NIACRO and extern, a whole range of hostels as well. So I think I am intrigued by Tom's question about what is the precise difference between the political and what are the particular problems that face the ex-political prisoner. Obviously, you highlighted some of the legislative problems like visas and things like that. But then again, if you've committed serious offences, America and Australia are not that keen, whatever they are, whether they're political or just ordinary serious offences.
I think there are very strong parallels, but I think that in the midst of looking at the parallels, if that's a road we all go down, we shouldn't lose the sense of difference as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
At a number of levels, not least that what you believe in your head does make a difference to the experience. So if you feel yourself as an isolated individual, criminal in jail, that's a very different experience for feeling that you're part of an organisation that's bringing it to the enemy or whatever, you know. And the other thing that I think is probably very different is that, well, two other things maybe. One of the pieces of research points out that I think it's a quarter of all Republicans, I don't know about loyalists, a quarter of all Republicans in prisons were first imprisoned as children by the UN definition of children under 18 years of age, which is quite a colossal proportion of a constituency that went through that experience, and that makes it quite distinct. Anyway, I think there are distinct points that we shouldn't lose in the thing.
I think the vast majority of, the vast majority of ordinary decent prisoners, would be people who were on pretty short term. Perceptions of a domestic murder, manslaughter, most of the cases are mostly pleaded out, most spouse killing and stuff. The vast majority of people in burglaries, joyriding, not paying the TV license and stuff like that. I mean, I would look at the percentage of Republican ex-prisoners, we were serving 10 years in prison. And that's if you got an 8-year sentence, it was for carrying that documentation that you were in Sinn Féin or something.
Yeah.
So I think that would be revised, the long-term effects in relation to that. And even with a life sentence to prisoners, or if you're your spouse or something, I think you were at least after 8 years.
Was Gusty Spence the longest term in prison?
Well, there's actually a friend of mine that's 30th year now.
30th?
1977. Well, he had a year break.
Oh yeah, so it's consecutive, but at a single time, Gusty was in 19?
19, I think.
Malcolm Street, Malcolm Street, 21.
No, there were more. There's more 75 from
Claire and then you.
It strikes me, I suppose, that one of the differences, and you alluded to it there, was the role of ex-prisoners in conflict transformation, and in broadest sense that word, you talked about a community level, but then I suppose we can also think of role of ex-prisoners in government, and do you know what I mean, all of that. So I just think that's one of the things to sort of pay attention to, is like the potential role of ex-prisoners, and then, as you said, the kind of like unknown role of ex-combatants, in all of that work as well, and is that being fully realised, because of these barriers, or is it not? And it just seems like a very rich kind of area of inquiry.
Yeah.
It's ironic that tomorrow morning I'm bringing 4 PSNI inspectors going to come in prison. I'm doing a CAP training program, community completion translation, and part of that is to suggest bringing people away, and at the meeting that you are with, I have to in the morning.
Are you bringing them, come in to do what with them?
No, just come down the tour, and I've got them coming in the West Belfast. So that's it, because when I first went into the room there doing the training two months ago, I mean, in comparison to 10 years ago when I went into Coromela, people left the room because myself and Billy Mitchell, the APIC member, people were annoyed. I went into the training to do all the inspectors with her, and the pod live, not to go for a drink, and I was doing talk politics. Big, massive difference at the point that the trust me to pick them up on the neighbourhood road.
But you guys and you, Claire, you see
that,
this all the time.
Yeah.
I remember when it really hit me once, the most forcefully was about 4 years ago, when Mike Ritchie was leaving Kirsten to be director in CHA, and there was a going away lunch in Taranal, so I arrived a bit late and went into it and walked in, and the big round tables and everybody's eating lunch in a Republican ex-prisoners place, and the first table contained top UDA and top UVF people sitting together having lunch, and I didn't know whether that was more remarkable or that they were in a Republican place or not. But I mean, but I go back to my point about below the radar. I think that there's incredible conflict transformation stuff going on below the radar, which to me in the end, I don't know if it's more important than the big, Martin McGuinness being Deputy First Minister or whatever, but certainly to me that's the bedrock which is going to make the difference. It's not the First Minister necessarily, it's the bedrock stuff that counts.
You see, the kind of thing I observed very, very stark with the ex-prisoners when I started in 1989, and our scene is when they stopped being ex-prisoner, that's what we said in civic society, in authorities, when do we stop, when do we take that bit of the law? We're probably accused and perpetuated, because grants and stuff ourselves, but that was I think because of this kind of stigma, and I think we've actually moved beyond that. You know, the point is that we're getting into, I mean, then they don't want experts near conferences, now you can have a conference, you have it, they have their input, and that's exactly by Willie Fraser. You can sit down and say how you drove and stuff like that there. So we have, I think we've won that kind of battle, but it's on the legal front in this, you know, and insurance and stuff
That's a
like
good
that
point.
there. You know, there, but the contradiction of that there is when I got in 1989, I worked for the training and employment project and the New Lodge with Paul Neal, and I came out of university degree, wanted to work with young people, so I went and got a PACS check, as they call it, access on there. Then myself and I got a whole squad, 6 prisoners, 2 of them actually became city councillors in MLA and photojournalists, as you probably know, Rob. And I went, and we were cleared within 3 or 4 weeks. PACS check, that was the RUC of them, to work in a youth centre with the BLB and the Bates. So I had the 2 organisations had to clear me. You know, so somewhere there's a police officer somewhere who had the common sense. Now I was on 3 convictions over a 25-30 year period, possession of arms, possession of a bomb, and murder. Don't use that term, but given a life sentence. They cleared me within that term that I could work with young people. Yet I can't foster, yet I can't have house insurance, so there was that contradiction. And later on, about 6 months later, we had a young woman come in, and I could do voluntary work. I said, I have to put you through PACS, and she was not back. Because she was caught in possession of a DVD recorder. So she was trying to put it. And when I went to the BLB, another person was knocked back because I got a 6 month suspended sentence for ABH at the football match. He spat it up, or spat it up, or they got arrested. So I asked the BLB, why did you clear me? I'm 60 machine guns, ambushes, bombs, and all that. Says, we know who you are. These people, we can't trust this person because he lifted his hand at the football match and you may do that with a child. Or the person who had the stolen DVD player who bought it on the black market. We don't know that person who couldn't see it. So it was that kind of recognition that you were a political prisoner.
And they're making this distinction.
Yeah, I mean, this is the police and this was the early PACS. Yeah. And at Access Northern Ireland, we had meetings with them, because that's in the UK way, we don't agree with that sort of stuff, that's us being Republicans. But they come over and they met with us in relation to that particular aspect. Because we're English people saying, oh, they're charged with a crime, it's a crime there.
Yes.
And as you know, we met with the Bureau of Insurers.
I think that's the problem with insurers, most of which will be based outside of here. And
Yeah,
they don't see the nuances.
Well, they were Englishmen, and we met them in Tarnal, and we said, look here, given the whole role in the conflict, there's members of the government, and the deputy, the first and deputy first minister, former political prisoners themselves, so they had, okay, we didn't look at that. So now they have 2 questions they do in the insurance, we charge with criminal act, or we charge with schedule of offence.
Joe, I'm going to stop you.
Oh, sorry.
Are you sitting on a Hugh? McGee, are you alright? Rebecca, we're looking over your shoulder.
Fog in the room. Let's pull the curtains. Maybe just a few miscellaneous comments. Just to start with, just to pick up an issue with tax checks. I don't know if anybody else in the room here has been involved in supporting the ex-prisoners, political ex-prisoners applying to university. But I've been through some excruciating interviews in here because the process beyond familiar is that whether you declare or not your prison sentence, it gets revealed in the check the university does at the point of application, and you get called for an interview with the university authorities. And if you're the sponsor or in the course, you get those meetings. And some of those discussions have been excruciating for me to take part. I've been embarrassed. Because the sensibilities of the individual and the panel are engaged as well as the institution's sensibilities. So it's a very uncomfortable experience for me around that. The thing about the agent, Tim and I work with prisoners in the Lawless Wing. We've been doing that for the last 2 years in McGabry. There are a lot of young people in the Lawless Wing, and it seems just through observation when we see them in their yard, in the dissident Republican side who are in prison at the moment. So, and they're young prisoners.
Yeah.
The prison officers thing, Bill, is an intriguing story. Tim and I, along with another colleague, are writing up a paper based on interviews with prison officers, and it seems to us that one of the real untold stories, and verifying this is challenging, but the self-report from about 100 officers that we have interviewed, is of very high rates of mental health problems in prison officers and a high mortality rate around alcohol abuse and suicide, which is untold. This has been hidden in their labour force. And I agree with your comment about this stuff that stays below the radar, but some of the work we'd be aware of that's happening in the community below the radar, I think we're about to have a really serious problem around financial support for a whole range of initiatives.
Thanks. Just one point to make. Well, 2 points of response. Yes, Patrick McGee, remember, did a doctorate in this university while he was still in prison. As he led ODY. 2 Republicans I know of, and I know that I was partially involved in the arguments at the time to allow them to be enrolled, which at first were refused and then were overturned. So I suppose, I mean, that was relatively early on in the process, so I suppose, you know, we can give ourselves a partial pat on the back in relation to some of that. The other point is just to mention that I didn't know you were doing that research on the prison officers, but there's also some stuff in the prison archive, stuff that, the film stuff that Callum McLaughlin is doing at Coleraine, where he's interviewed. What he's been doing, if you don't know about it, it's been really wonderful. He brings people back to the prison that they were in, whether they were as an education officer, a prisoner, a prison officer, or whatever, and interviews them in situ. And the in situ thing makes so much difference because you can see just by the body language of the people what the effects are of going back into it. I remember seeing Billy Hutchinson walked in, and Billy was like a child going back to, you know, a playground he'd been in when he was 5. Oh, look, there's, oh, I forgot, you know. Whereas there was a prison officer, Wilkinson, is he Wilkinson? Waterworth, where he gives the whole interview literally with his back against the wall. He's hugging the wall tight, as if he cannot walk out into the space because he doesn't know what's behind him. And it's so symbolic to see that footage, you know. Who was, sorry?
Bill, just maybe moving back to the previous discussion about the role of politically motivated ex-prisoners in conflict transformation, that resonated with me in terms of some of my interests around the role of sport in terms of community reconciliation. I read a report recently commissioned by the National Lottery. It's actually written by a guy called Fred Coulter, who works in the University of Stirling but is originally from East Belfast. And he's incredibly sceptical about claims that are made about the value of sport in terms of addressing a whole range of social problems. In that report, one of the things that it does do is to commend the contribution that ex-prisoners make at the sort of community level. And I was just really wondering what the literature says about why there seems to be that fit between ex-prisoners, politically motivated ex-prisoners, and sort of community development. Is it because of the bottom-up approach? Is it because of the status of these individuals within their communities?
Yes, and yes. Plus, come in if you want.
Community.
Okay, let them answer.
It's about the sense of community there in prison.
And the point about it is, you see, like it or not, or like us or not, the way we looked at it was we were in prison for a very clear political objective, and it was at the end of the day for the betterment of our community, of our people, of our country, depending on what level you want to work at it. And so even a lot of people who, once they finished their imprisonment and they came out of prison and they didn't get involved in anything else, a lot of them got involved in that community development simply because that is what had motivated them at a really sort of basic level in the beginning. And then, you know, it's simply part of doing what you started doing, even though it's a million miles away from it at the same time.
And you were empowered in there too. I mean,